Cops harass black family while they're barbecuing, unaware the father is an FBI agent. On a warm and bright Saturday afternoon, the Harris family was enjoying their day at the local park. The sun shone brightly in the sky, making the air feel just right for a family barbecue. James Harris, a dedicated FBI agent, had been working hard all week, and today he was eager to spend some relaxing time with his wife, Leela, and their two children, Malik and Aisha. They had been looking forward to this simple day of fun for weeks. James set up the grill, while Leela arranged the picnic blanket, making sure the kids had a comfortable spot to sit. The sound of laughter filled the air as Malik, their energetic son, ran around with a soccer ball, and Aisha, their curious daughter, helped her mom by handing her the bottles of drinks. The family felt happy and free, enjoying each other's company in the beautiful setting of the park. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt perfect, and they couldn't have asked for a better way to spend their Saturday. Meanwhile, across the park, two police officers were driving around on their regular patrol. Officer Ryan and Officer Hayes were scanning the park, keeping an eye on things as they cruised by. It was just another day on duty, or so they thought. They noticed the Harris family by the grill. The officers looked at them for a moment, then exchanged glances. There was something about the scene that caught their attention, though neither officer could pinpoint exactly why. Without saying much, they decided to drive closer. As they got nearer to the family, they slowed down and parked their patrol car. James noticed the officers approaching but didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was a public park, and many people were enjoying the day outdoors. However, as the officers walked towards them, their expressions seemed a little off. James stood up, wiped his hands on his shirt, and greeted them with a friendly smile. "Good afternoon, officers," James said politely. "How can we help you?" Officer Ryan looked at James with a neutral expression, but there was something in his gaze that James couldn't quite read. It was almost as if the officer was suspicious of them, for no clear reason. Officer Hayes, standing beside him, crossed his arms, his body language tense. "We need to see some identification," Officer Ryan said without much of a greeting. "What are you doing here?" James, slightly surprised, answered calmly. "We're just having a barbecue with my family. It's a public park after all." The officers didn't seem satisfied with the response. They exchanged another glance, and then Officer Hayes spoke up. "We're going to need to see some ID from everyone here. It's standard procedure." James was caught off guard. He had been to this park many times before, and he knew there was no rule against having a barbecue. Yet the officers seemed insistent. He turned to his wife and nodded, signaling her to stay calm. Leela looked concerned, but she did her best to stay composed for the kids' sake. "Is there a reason why you need to see our IDs?" James asked, his voice steady but now more serious. "We're just a family enjoying a day out." Officer Ryan didn't give a direct answer, but instead looked at the grill and then at the family. "We have to make sure there's nothing unusual going on," he said vaguely. James could feel the tension growing. Something didn't sit right with him. He glanced around the park, where a few other people were enjoying their day, but no one else seemed to be getting questioned. It felt like they were being singled out for some reason, and James couldn't help but wonder if their race had something to do with it. Leela, noticing the change in James's tone, stood up and walked over to his side, gently holding his arm. "We don't have anything to hide," she said in a calm, collected voice. "But it's odd that you're asking for our IDs. Why don't you let us enjoy our day?" The officers didn't seem to be swayed by her words. Officer Hayes took a step forward, his eyes scanning the family in a way that made them all feel uncomfortable. "I said we need to see IDs," he repeated, his tone now more firm, almost demanding. James took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He understood that the officers were just doing their job, but something about the way they were treating him and his family felt wrong. "I'm an FBI agent," he said, deciding to be upfront with them. "Here's my badge." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his FBI badge, hoping that would end the situation. But as he held it out, neither officer made any move to take it. Instead, Officer Ryan simply stared at the badge for a moment, then looked back at James without saying a word. Officer Hayes remained silent as well, his face hardening, and the atmosphere became even more tense. James couldn't believe it. He had hoped that revealing his profession would help resolve the situation, but instead, it felt like the officers were more skeptical than ever. Leela stepped closer, standing protectively in front of their children, who were now looking confused and worried. Malik, who had been running around just moments before, now stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Isha, clutching her stuffed toy, looked up at her father with big, frightened eyes. James could feel his heart ache as he saw the fear in his children's faces. It was supposed to be a day of laughter and family time, but instead, it was turning into an uncomfortable and frightening encounter. The once peaceful day at the park now felt uncertain as the officers continued to scrutinize every movement the family made. James kept his composure, knowing that he needed to stay calm for the sake of his family. "I understand you're doing your job," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "But we're just here for a barbecue. We're not causing any trouble. If that's all you need, we can continue with our day." The officers didn't respond right away. Instead, they just stood there, staring at James and his family. It was as if they were waiting for something. James couldn't figure out what that something was. It seemed like the officers were determined to make this situation more complicated than it needed to be. As the tense silence stretched on, James could feel his patience beginning to wear thin. He stood there, holding his badge out toward the officers, waiting for them to acknowledge it. He hoped that showing his badge would clear things up, but instead, it only seemed to increase the suspicion in their eyes. It was clear that the officers weren't interested in letting the situation go easily. Leila, still standing close to her children, could feel the weight of the moment, too. She had always known that James's job could sometimes put him in difficult situations, but she never expected something like this to happen while they were just having a simple family barbecue. She had always tried to shield her kids from the harsh realities of the world, but today, that shield was beginning to crack. Malik, their 10-year-old son, was still standing off to the side, clutching the soccer ball in his hands. He could feel the tension in the air. He wasn't used to seeing his parents act this way. Normally, they were relaxed and carefree, but today something felt different. He looked from his mom to his dad and then to the officers, his young face full of confusion. He didn't understand why the police were asking so many questions. They had done nothing wrong. Aisha, who was only 6, was even more confused. She held her stuffed animal tightly in her hands and looked up at her father, sensing the change in the atmosphere. She could see that her mom and dad were trying to stay calm, but she could tell something was off. The officers didn't seem friendly, and their voices were harsh, not like the kind of people she'd always been taught to trust. James sighed and tucked his badge back into his pocket, trying to make the officers realize that there was no need for this interrogation. "I understand you're just doing your job," he said, his voice calm but firm, "but this is unnecessary. We're not doing anything wrong. We're just here to enjoy a family outing." But the officers didn't seem to be listening. Officer Ryan, the taller of the two, took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked over James once more. "What exactly are you doing here?" he asked, his voice colder now. "Why the barbecue? It's not exactly common for people to just set up like this." James raised an eyebrow, trying to maintain his composure. "It's a public park. People come here all the time to enjoy the outdoors, have a picnic or grill. This is not out of the ordinary." Officer Hayes, the other officer, crossed his arms in front of his chest. He didn't say anything for a moment, but his posture was still stiff. "You sure there's nothing else going on here?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. James could feel his frustration starting to build. He had dealt with difficult situations in his job before, but this was different. This wasn't about crime or law enforcement. This was about a family trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon in a public space. And yet, for some reason, these officers were determined to make it more than that. Leila took a step forward, placing a gentle hand on James's arm. She knew how difficult it could be for James to keep his cool in situations like this, and she didn't want the tension to escalate further. She gave the officers a polite smile, trying to ease the situation. "We're not causing any trouble," she said calmly. "We're just here to spend time together. The kids are having fun and we're enjoying the day. Is there any reason you're questioning us?" The officers exchanged a brief look, and for a moment it seemed like they might back off. But then Officer Ryan spoke again, his voice still edged with doubt. "We're just trying to make sure everything's okay. We've had reports of people causing problems in this area, and we have to check things out." James could feel the frustration rising in him. "If there have been problems, why aren't you checking the other people in the park?" he asked, gesturing toward the families and individuals scattered throughout the area. Why single us out? The officers didn't answer. Instead, they just stood there, still scrutinizing the family. The silence stretched on, making everyone feel more and more uncomfortable. James knew that if this continued, things could quickly escalate into something far worse than a simple misunderstanding. He glanced at Leela, who was still trying to maintain her calm demeanor for the sake of their children. But he could see the concern in her eyes. This wasn't just about a barbecue anymore, it was about their safety, and that scared him more than he cared to admit. The situation was starting to feel out of control. The officers' refusal to listen to reason was causing the tension to build, and James was starting to wonder if there was something more to their suspicion. It wasn't just the questioning, it was the way they looked at him as if they were waiting for him to make a wrong move. "James," Leela said quietly, "just let's go, let's pack up and leave." Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for their children, too. She didn't want them to be part of this any longer than they had to be. James hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to back down. He knew they had every right to be there, but he also knew that sometimes avoiding conflict was the wisest choice. He nodded slowly, glancing down at Malik and Aisha. He didn't want them to see him argue with the police, especially when they were so young. But just as James was about to speak, Officer Ryan made a move that caught him off guard. "We'll need to check your IDs before you leave," he said, his voice firm. "It's standard procedure." James felt a surge of anger, but he kept it under control. He had been patient up until now, but this felt like too much. "I told you," he said slowly, his voice steady. "I'm an FBI agent. I don't need to show you my ID again." The officers remained silent for a moment, and James could feel his heart racing. He knew that this was the tipping point. If they insisted on checking IDs, things could escalate quickly, and he didn't want that to happen in front of his children. "James," Leela whispered again, this time more urgently. "We can leave. Let's just go. We'll deal with this later." For a brief moment, James considered her suggestion. He didn't want to cause a scene, especially not in front of their kids, but he also didn't want to let this injustice stand. If he left now, it would feel like admitting that they were wrong for simply enjoying a day at the park. He glanced over at Malik, who was still standing quietly off to the side, clutching his soccer ball tightly. Then he looked at Isha, whose eyes were wide with worry. He couldn't let them think that this was normal, that they should be afraid of the police, that they had to let things go when something wasn't right. "I'm not going anywhere," James said firmly, looking directly at the officers. "We're leaving because we want to, not because you're making us. I'm not showing you any more IDs. We've done nothing wrong." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Officer Hayes looked like he was about to speak, but then he seemed to hesitate. Finally, Officer Ryan spoke up. "We're just doing our job. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." James's mind raced, but he refused to back down. "This is harder than it needs to be because you're making it that way. We've been more than patient with you. Now, if you don't mind, we're going to finish our day." For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a final glance at the Harris family, the officers turned and walked back toward their patrol car. James watched them go, feeling the tension in his shoulders slowly start to fade. The moment they were out of earshot, Leela let out a long breath, her body relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. "Let's go home," she said softly, her voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. James nodded and turned to gather their things, but as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. It wasn't just the officers' actions. It was everything about the way they had treated him and his family. He knew that, no matter how much he wanted to let it go, this was far from over. As James packed up their things, his mind was racing. The encounter with the police officers had shaken him, but he didn't want to show it. He was determined not to let this ruin the day for his family. He glanced at Leela, who was quietly folding the picnic blanket. She looked exhausted, her face a mixture of relief and concern. She had handled the situation as best as she could, but he could tell it had taken a toll on her. Their children, Malik and Aisha, were unusually quiet. Malik, who had been running around the park just an hour earlier, was now standing still, his soccer ball forgotten at his feet. He looked up at his parents, as if waiting for them to tell him what to do next. Isha, her small hand clutching her stuffed animal, looked up at her father with big, worried eyes. She had seen the tension, felt the unease, and now she didn't fully understand why the fun day they had been looking forward to had turned into something so stressful. James finished packing up the cooler and began stacking the folding chairs. He wanted to move quickly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why had the officers treated them like that? They were just a family at a park, enjoying a sunny afternoon together. It didn't make sense. He glanced over at Leela, and for a moment their eyes met. She could tell that his mind was still on the encounter, and it worried her. "We're almost done here," James said softly, trying to break the silence. He smiled at Malik and Aisha, but it wasn't the usual warm smile they were used to. It was a smile that hid a lot of frustration and confusion. "Let's get everything in the car and then we'll go home, okay?" Malik nodded, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "Are we really leaving?" he asked, his voice small. "I don't understand why they were mean to us, Dad." James stopped what he was doing and looked at his son. He knelt down so that he was eye level with Malik. "We're leaving because we want to," he said gently. "Sometimes people make mistakes, but we don't let it spoil our day. We did nothing wrong, Malik. We just wanted to have some fun, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We'll have fun at home, too." Malik nodded again, but his brow furrowed, and James could tell that the situation wasn't as easy for him to forget. He was old enough to understand that something had happened, but not quite old enough to fully understand why it was so unfair. James could see the wheels turning in his son's head. He could already tell that this experience would stick with Malik for a long time. Isha, who had been holding her stuffed animal tightly, now reached out and tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, are the police always mean?" she asked, her voice soft and innocent. Leela knelt down and hugged Isha close, her heart breaking at the question. "No, sweetie, not all police are mean. But sometimes there are bad situations, and sometimes people make bad decisions. We don't judge everyone by one experience, okay?" She looked over at James, who was standing nearby, still lost in thought. Leela knew how much this had affected him, but she also knew that their children were watching and learning from how they handled things. James stood up slowly and looked at his family. He didn't want them to feel afraid or confused. He had always tried to shield them from the harder parts of the world, but today was different. Today, they had been exposed to something they hadn't understood before: racial profiling. It was a hard lesson, but it was a lesson that no family should have to learn. "I think we're ready to go," James said, his voice a little hoarse. "Let's get to the car and we'll head home. We'll talk more when we get there." The drive home was quiet. The usual sounds of chatter and laughter that would fill the car on the way home were replaced by silence. The kids were lost in their own thoughts, and James and Leela didn't know what to say to break the quiet. Leela glanced at James from time to time, but he didn't meet her gaze. He was focused on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. He wasn't angry, but he was frustrated, and that frustration was eating away at him. As they pulled into their driveway, James noticed the familiar comfort of home. It should have felt like a relief, but instead, he felt a sense of heaviness. This was supposed to be their safe place, their sanctuary from the world. But now, it felt like the world had followed them here. He didn't want to let the day's events ruin their home, but he also knew that they needed to talk about what had happened. He parked the car and turned off the engine. For a moment, no one moved. Then Leela spoke. "I think we need to talk," she said quietly, "about what happened." James took a deep breath. He knew she was right. They couldn't just pretend that everything was fine and move on. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew they needed to address what had happened, especially for the sake of their kids. "Malik, Isha, let's go inside," Leela said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't want to overwhelm them, but they needed to start the conversation. She wasn't sure how to explain everything, but she knew that they had to face the reality of what they had experienced. The kids followed them inside, and they all sat down in the living room. James sat on the couch, his hands resting in his lap. Leela sat next to him, her arm around his shoulders. The kids sat in front of them, Malik fidgeting with his soccer ball and Aisha clutching her stuffed animal. The room was still, the weight of the earlier events hanging in the air. "We don't always know why people do things," James began, his voice quiet. "Sometimes people make assumptions based on things they don't understand. What happened today wasn't right, but it's important for you to know that you don't have to be afraid." Leela nodded in agreement. "The police aren't always like that," she said. "But sometimes people let their fears or misunderstandings affect the way they treat others. It's not your fault and it's not our fault. We didn't do anything wrong today." Malik looked up at his parents. "But why did they treat us like that?" he asked. "We were just having fun." James sighed deeply. He didn't have all the answers, and he hated that Malik had to ask these kinds of questions at such a young age. "Some people just see things differently, Malik," he said softly. "Sometimes they judge others based on things that aren't true, like the color of their skin or where they come from. That's called prejudice, and it's wrong." Isha looked confused. "But why did the police say we were causing trouble?" James looked at Leela and then back at their children. "The truth is, Isha, some people are afraid of what they don't understand. They think that everyone is a threat, even when they're not. And sometimes they take that fear out on others, like what happened today." Leela gave James a soft smile, trying to comfort him as much as the kids. She knew this wasn't easy for him, but it was important to share the truth, even if it was hard. "What happened wasn't fair, but we have to stick together. We have to support each other and not let people's fear or ignorance make us feel less than who we are." Malik and Aisha sat quietly, absorbing what their parents had said. They didn't fully understand everything, but they could feel the love and protection in their parents' words. James could see that the kids were starting to process the conversation, but he also knew that this would be something they would carry with them for a long time. "We're not going to let this stop us from having fun or enjoying our lives," James said, his voice firm but gentle. "But we also have to remember that there are some things in this world that aren't fair, and we need to be strong enough to handle them." Leela hugged both kids close, her heart full of love and pride for how they were handling the situation. "You're both so strong," she said softly, "and you'll always have us to protect you no matter what." The evening was quiet as they sat together in the living room. The day had been tough, but it had also brought them closer as a family. James didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He would always stand by his family, and together they would face whatever challenges came their way. The following days after the encounter at the park were filled with a mixture of reflection and quiet. Tension. James couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unresolved. The officers had left without offering an apology, without even acknowledging the wrongness of their actions. And though they had gone back to their routine, James couldn't help but replay the event in his mind over and over, wondering if there was something he could have done differently. At home, life had returned to a sense of normalcy. The kids had gone back to their activities, Malik to his soccer practice and Aisha to her drawing, but there was an underlying sense that everything had changed. Even though they had tried to move on, the conversation they had at home still lingered. James could see it in the way Malik sometimes stared out the window, or in the way Aisha clutched her stuffed animal a little tighter when she was nervous. The incident had left a mark, and James knew it would take time for them to truly process it. Leela, on the other hand, had been doing her best to support James. She knew how deeply the whole situation had affected him, and she saw the weight he carried. He had been so calm when everything was happening, but she knew that James wasn't someone who easily let go of something that didn't feel right. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle tough situations, but this was different. This wasn't about solving a crime or working a case. It was about his own family being unfairly targeted. It was about the harsh reality of racial prejudice, and that was something he had never expected to face so directly. The morning after the incident, as they sat down for breakfast, Leela could sense the quiet heaviness in the air. The kids were eating, but their faces were serious, and the usual chatter wasn't there. Malik picked at his pancakes, his thoughts clearly somewhere else. Isha, who was normally full of energy, sat quietly, her eyes glued to her cereal bowl. James, sitting across from them, finally spoke. "I know things have been a little heavy lately," he said, trying to keep his voice light, though he could feel the weight in his own chest. "But we need to keep moving forward. I want you both to know that just because something unfair happened doesn't mean it defines us. We're a strong family, and we've got each other's backs." Malik looked up, meeting his father's gaze. "But why did they treat us like that?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion and a bit of frustration. "We didn't do anything wrong." James sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Sometimes people make assumptions based on things they don't understand. And when those assumptions turn into actions, it can lead to things like what happened at the park. But you have to remember, it's not about who you are, it's about the other person's misunderstanding." Leela reached out and gently touched Malik's hand. "What matters most is how we handle it," she said softly. We can't control other people's actions, but we can control our own, and we'll always stand together. Aisha, who had been silent up until now, suddenly spoke up. Are the police bad? Her voice was small, and her eyes were wide with concern. James's heart sank. He had hoped they wouldn't have to discuss this with such young children, but the question had come up, and there was no avoiding it. He looked at Leela, and she nodded, signaling that they needed to be honest with their kids, even if it was difficult. No, sweetie, James said softly, trying to find the right words. Not all police are bad. Some police officers do a very important job keeping people safe. But sometimes there are officers who don't make the right choices, and when that happens, we have to stand up for what's right. Leela smiled warmly at Isha. The important thing to remember is that there are good people everywhere, and we need to always do what's right, no matter what. Malik nodded slowly, absorbing the words, though he still seemed troubled. I just don't get it. Why did they have to pick on us? He repeated, his voice a little more insistent this time. James didn't have an easy answer for him. It's not something that's easy to understand, he said, his tone gentle but firm. Some people act out of fear or misunderstanding. It's wrong, but it's something we have to deal with sometimes, Leela added. And the best way to handle it is to be the bigger person. We can't change everyone's mind, but we can show the world who we are by being kind, respectful, and strong. The conversation paused, and James could see that Malik was still processing it all. He understood the logic, but the emotional weight of what had happened was still there. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a simple conversation or an explanation. The kids needed time, just like James and Leela did. Later that day, James decided to take a walk. He needed to clear his head and think things through. Leela knew he needed some space, so she kept the kids busy with their own activities. As James walked down the quiet street, the cool air helped to calm him, but his mind was still swirling. He had been through plenty of tough cases in his career, but this was something else. This wasn't about criminals or bad guys. This was about something much bigger. This was about the system and about a society that sometimes overlooked the humanity of others. It was a hard truth, and one that James wasn't sure how to tackle. As he walked, he couldn't help but replay the moment when he had shown his FBI badge to the officers. He had hoped that it would end the situation, but instead, it had only seemed to make things more complicated. The officers had questioned him further, as if they didn't believe him. It had shaken his confidence in a way that he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his badge didn't carry the weight it once did. James stopped at a bench and sat down, taking a deep breath. It wasn't just about the officers. It was about the world his children were growing up in. He didn't want them to carry the weight of these kinds of experiences with them. He wanted them to feel safe and loved, no matter where they went. He wanted them to know that the world could be a good place. But now, he wasn't so sure. He took out his phone and dialed a number. It rang a few times before someone picked up. Hey, it's James, he said, his voice calm but tired. I just wanted to talk about something that happened a few days ago. Can we meet? The voice on the other end was warm and understanding. Of course, James, let's meet tomorrow. We'll figure this out. James ended the call and stood up, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. The situation wasn't over, but at least he knew he wasn't alone. There were people who cared, people who understood, and people who were ready to make things better. James didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let this slide. He would make sure that this incident wasn't forgotten, for his family, for his kids, for everyone who had ever been unfairly judged because of who they were. The walk home was a bit easier. James still had a lot to process, but he felt lighter knowing that he was taking the next step. He couldn't fix everything in one day, but he could start by making sure his family felt heard, respected, and supported. When he got home, he walked inside to find Leela sitting on the couch with the kids. They were watching a movie together, the comfort of normalcy settling back in. As he walked into the room, Leela looked up and smiled. He smiled back, grateful for her unwavering support. Everything okay? She asked, noticing the calmness in his demeanor. Yeah, James replied, taking a seat next to her. I'm going to meet with someone tomorrow. We're going to figure out what to do next. Leela nodded. I'm proud of you, she said softly. We'll get through this together. James took her hand, feeling the warmth of her touch. Together, he agreed. Always. The following day, James woke up with a sense of purpose. He had spent the last few hours thinking about the meeting, wondering what the next steps would be. There was still a part of him that felt unsettled, unsure of how to move forward, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just let the incident at the park fade away without taking action. He had to do something, not just for his family, but for all the other families who had faced similar challenges. As he got ready for the meeting, he found himself reflecting on the conversation with his kids. They had been so young, yet so perceptive. Their questions had forced him to confront the harsh reality of the world they were growing up in, a world where people were often judged based on the color of their skin. It wasn't a world he wanted for them, and it wasn't a world he wanted to be part of. But sometimes, he realized, change had to start with people like him, the ones who understood the system and had the tools to challenge it. When James arrived at the meeting, he was greeted by his colleague, Detective Maria Diaz. Maria had been a trusted friend for years, and James knew she shared his sense of justice. They had worked together on many cases before, but this one felt different. This was about more than just solving a crime or bringing someone to justice. This was about confronting a system that had allowed unfair treatment to happen, time and time again, without accountability. "Hey, James," Maria said, standing up from her desk and offering him a seat. "Thanks for coming in on such short notice. I know this isn't easy, but we're going to figure this out." James sat down, his mind already racing. "I just don't know where to start, Maria. What happened at the park? I don't even know how to explain it. It's like we were treated like criminals for no reason. I'm an FBI agent. I've dedicated my life to protecting people, and then just because of the color of my skin, I'm treated like a suspect." Maria nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I get it, I really do, but this isn't just about you. This happens to families all over the country. It's bigger than one isolated incident. It's about a culture that still has a long way to go when it comes to racial bias and profiling." James leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. He had heard the words before, but today they felt different. He couldn't shake the image of his children's faces, their confusion and fear. He had always done his best to shield them from the harsh realities of the world, but now it was clear that the world had found its way into their lives, whether he was ready for it or not. "I need to do something about this," James said firmly, his voice steady. "I can't just walk away and pretend it didn't happen. I need to make sure this doesn't happen again, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been unfairly treated." Maria looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "James, you're in a tough position. I know you want to make things right, but you also know how difficult it can be to fight a system that's been in place for so long. But if anyone can make a difference, it's you." James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but he knew that he couldn't turn back now. His family deserved better, and so did every other family who had been treated unfairly by those who were supposed to protect them. After the meeting, James went home, his mind still buzzing with everything they had discussed. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make sure that the voices of those who had been wronged were heard. He wasn't sure exactly what form that would take, whether it would be a public statement, a legal challenge, or something else, but he knew he had to start somewhere. That evening, as he sat down for dinner with his family, he could feel the change in the air. There was a quiet understanding between him and Leela, a shared sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The kids were still adjusting to everything that had happened, but James could tell they were beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation. They had seen how their father had handled the officers at the park, and now they were seeing him take action in a different way. Over dinner, James turned to Malik and Aisha, who were sitting quietly, pushing their food around on their plates. "I want to talk to you both about something," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What happened at the park? It wasn't right. And I don't want you to ever feel like you have to stay silent when you see something unfair happening. You have a voice and you deserve to use it." Malik looked up from his plate, his eyes serious. "But what can we do, Dad?" he asked. "What if people don't listen?" James smiled gently, trying to reassure his son. "Sometimes it takes a while for people to listen, but that doesn't mean you give up. You keep speaking up and you keep standing up for what's right. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step counts." Leela put her hand on James's, her fingers intertwining with his. "We're all in this together," she said softly, "and we'll always be there for you, James. We'll support you no matter what." The conversation continued through dinner, and by the time they were finished, James felt a sense of calm settle over him. His family was behind him, and that made all the difference. They had weathered storms together before, and they would weather this one too. The next few days were filled with phone calls, meetings, and research. James had contacted a lawyer who specialized in civil rights cases, hoping to find a legal avenue to challenge what had happened. He also reached out to other families who had experienced similar incidents, hoping to build a coalition of people who could stand together and demand accountability. The more he learned, the more determined he became. He spoke to community leaders, attended rallies, and began using his platform to raise awareness. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but he also knew that silence would only allow the problem to persist. He couldn't stay quiet, not when his children's future was at stake. One evening, as he sat at his desk reviewing notes for an upcoming meeting, James received a call. It was from Maria. She sounded excited. "James, I think we've got something," she said. "I've been talking to some people in the department, and I think we can make some real changes. It won't be easy, but we can start pushing for accountability. I know it's not the perfect solution, but it's a start." James felt a surge of hope. "I'm in," he said without hesitation. "Let's do it." Over the next few months, James worked tirelessly to make sure that the incident at the park wasn't forgotten. He continued to speak out, pushing for reforms and working with others who shared his vision. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when he felt like giving up, but he knew that the fight was worth it. One day, months later, as James walked through the park where everything had started, he felt a sense of peace. The path had been long and challenging, but he had made a difference. Not just for his family, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated. And as he looked up at the sky, he knew that this was just the beginning. He turned around and saw his family walking toward him, smiling and laughing together. For the first time in a long time, James felt hopeful about the future. There was still work to be done, but they were a family that faced challenges head-on. And no matter what happened next, he knew they would always have each other.